Today, it is a small, bustling state known for blue crabs, historic harbors, and a quiet suburban sway between the political titans of the North and the cultural rhythms of the South. But to step into Maryland in the 1800s is to step onto the most fraught and fractured borderland in a nation tearing itself apart. This is not a story of a unified frontier or a cohesive colony turned state. It is the story of a house divided, not by metaphor, but by law, economy, and river. The story of Maryland's 19th century is a microcosm of the American experiment, a relentless and often brutal negotiation between liberty and property, progress and tradition, a past that refused to die and a future that demanded to be born. Through this journey, we will witness how a single state, poised on the Mason-Dixon line, embodied every contradiction of a young nation, its fate forever shaped by the railroad, the oyster, the wrenching debate over the soul of a man, and the blood that soaked its own cornfields. Our story begins not in 1800, but in the lingering echo of a founding compromise. Maryland is a borderland from its very conception. North of the Potomac River, it is a slave state, but it is not the Deep South. Its tobacco-based plantation economy, which dominated the 1700s, is in steep decline, exhausted by poor farming practices and fluctuating markets. In the northern and western counties, places like Frederick and Hagerstown, German and Scotch-Irish immigrants practice small-scale, diversified farming with few or no enslaved people. In the booming port city of Baltimore, the third largest in the nation by 1820, a vibrant mercantile class, powered by shipbuilding, banking, and trade, looks increasingly to a free labor future. Yet on the broad, flat plantations of the southern Maryland Tidewater and the eastern shore, an entrenched aristocracy remains tethered to the peculiar institution. Maryland is not hurtling toward a single destiny. It is a state of two minds, two economies, and two moral universes held in a tense and unstable balance. The first great pivot arrives not on horseback but on iron rails, and its name is the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad. Chartered in 1827, just 2 years after the Erie Canal's triumph, the B&O is a declaration of war against geography and against economic obsolescence. Baltimore's merchants, led by visionaries like Philip E. Thomas and George Brown, are terrified of being bypassed. New York has the Erie Canal. Philadelphia and Charleston have their own grand projects. Baltimore's answer is to build a railroad over the Allegheny Mountains to the Ohio River, stitching the Midwest to the Chesapeake. It is a monumental, near impossible task. Engineers battle the savage grades of the Potomac River Gorge, carving tunnels through solid rock at Point of Rocks, building the magnificent Thomas Viaduct over the Patapsco River. The railroad becomes a university of American engineering, a crucible of innovation and backbreaking labor, much of it done by Irish immigrants and free black laborers. When the first stone is laid on July 4, 1828, with 90-year-old Charles Carroll of Carrollton, the last surviving signer of the Declaration of Independence, doing the honors, it is a potent symbol, the revolutionary generation blessing the industrial future. The B&O does more than transport goods, it transports Maryland's psyche. It turns Baltimore's gaze decisively north and west, toward the free states and the dynamic, industrializing economy. Begins the slow, inexorable process of reorienting Maryland's economic heart away from the slave-dependent Tidewater. But as the iron horse charges west, another industry rises from the murky depths of the Chesapeake Bay, one that will anchor the old order, the oyster. In the mid-1800s, the bay's oyster beds are a liquid Klondike. Schooners by the thousands, the iconic Baltimore Clippers, and later, vast fleets of sleek, two-masted bugeyes and skipjacks, engage in the oyster wars. This is not mere fishing, it is a maritime gold rush. Oyster dredging is industrialized. Canning factories like the mammoth establishment of John W. Crisfield on the eastern shore spring up, employing armies of workers, many of them free black men and recent immigrants. The oyster boom creates immense wealth, but it also demands a vast, cheap labor force. On the eastern shore, this reinforces the social and economic structures of slavery and later rigid racial hierarchies. Watermen, boat captains, and packing house owners form a powerful political bloc, deeply conservative and protective of their way of life. The oyster, like the railroad, becomes more than an industry. It is a culture, a politics, and a counterweight to the forces of change emanating from Baltimore. And in the middle of this economic tug-of-war stands the most volatile question of all. The question of the nearly 90,000 enslaved black people within Maryland's borders in 1820 and the growing population of free black people, which is the largest of any state by 1860. Maryland becomes the central theater of the American conflict over slavery, precisely because it is a border state. The Underground Railroad doesn't just pass through Maryland. It has some of its busiest and most daring terminals here. Harriet Tubman, born into slavery in Dorchester County on the Eastern Shore, will make her first escape in 1849, then return time and time again, a one-woman liberation army leading scores to freedom along routes she knows intimately through the marshes and woods. In the cities, particularly Baltimore, free black communities flourish, creating powerful institutions like the Bethel African Methodist Episcopal Church. They build schools, mutual aid societies, and become a vocal abolitionist presence. Frederick Douglass, born on a Talbot County plantation, learns to read in Baltimore, plots his escape from its shipyards, and emerges as the nation's most electrifying orator and writer against the very system that once held him. This friction, this daily reality of flight, resistance, and a large free black population living in the shadow of bondage, creates a state of permanent crisis for the slaveholding elite. Their response is a tightening vice of repression. Slave codes are strengthened. Punishments for aiding escapes become draconian. And in 1857, the U.S. Supreme Court, led by Marylander Chief Justice Roger B. Taney, delivers the cataclysmic Dred Scott decision. Taney, a son of the Tidewater aristocracy, writes that black people have no rights which the white man was bound to respect, and that Congress cannot ban slavery in the territories. The ruling is meant to settle the slavery question forever in favor of the South. Instead, it electrifies the abolitionist movement and pushes the nation closer to the precipice. Maryland, through Taney, speaks for the most militant defense of slavery, even as half of Maryland chafes under it. When the storm finally breaks at Fort Sumter in April 1861, Maryland does not join the Confederacy, but it does not stand with the Union either. It convulses. Pro-Confederate mobs in Baltimore attack Massachusetts militia regiments marching between train stations on Pratt Street in the first bloodshed of the war. For a few terrifying days, Washington, D.C., the national capital, is cut off from the North, surrounded by what appears to be hostile territory. President Lincoln's response is swift and authoritarian. He suspends habeas corpus along the rail lines. Union troops occupy Baltimore, arresting secessionist legislators and mayors. Maryland is placed under what is, in effect, martial law to ensure it remains in the Union. Its strategic importance is absolute. Had Maryland seceded, Washington would have fallen, and the war might have been lost before it truly began. For 4 years, Maryland is an occupied state. Its sons fight on both sides, in the Union's Army of the Potomac and in the Confederate Army of Northern Virginia. Families are literally divided. The war comes home with a terrible intimacy. In September 1862, Robert E. Lee's first invasion of the North culminates at the Battle of Antietam, near the western Maryland town of Sharpsburg. It remains the single bloodiest day in American military history. Over 23,000 men are killed, wounded, or missing in 12 hours of savage combat. The cornfields, the sunken road, the Burnside Bridge, these Maryland landmarks become synonyms for slaughter. The battle is tactically inconclusive but strategically pivotal, giving Lincoln the opportunity to issue the preliminary Emancipation Proclamation. Yet with bitter irony, the proclamation only frees slaves in rebellious states. Slavery in loyal, border state Maryland remains untouched by federal decree. The true end of slavery in Maryland comes not from Washington, but from Annapolis. By 1864, with Union troops guaranteeing a pro-Union electorate, a new state constitution is put to a vote. Its central provision: the immediate and uncompensated emancipation of every enslaved person in the state. The soldier vote, cast by Maryland boys in blue, secures its narrow passage. On November 1, 1864, slavery in Maryland dies. It is a thunderclap of liberation, a social revolution achieved at the ballot box under the protection of federal bayonets. The cheers from Baltimore's black communities are matched by the grim silence and seething resentment on the Eastern Shore and in southern Maryland. The war ends, but the battle for Maryland's soul enters a new, grimmer phase. Reconstruction in Maryland is a paradoxical and violent affair. While not subject to federal military reconstruction, the state witnesses a fierce struggle over the meaning of freedom. Former slaves, now citizens, vote, hold office, and build communities. In Baltimore, Isaac Myers founds the Colored Caulkers Trade Union Society and establishes the Chesapeake Marine Railway and Dry Dock Company, a pioneering black-owned shipyard. But this progress is met with a vicious backlash. The state passes harsh, black codes to restrict labor and movement. And on the Eastern Shore, in places like Kent and Queen Anne's counties, a campaign of terror unfolds. Groups akin to the Ku Klux Klan, often called regulators or simply white posses, use lynching, arson, and intimidation to drive black people from their hard-won lands and voting booths, and to re-establish white democratic control. This is not the reconstruction of distant South Carolina. This is a localized, intimate reign of terror aimed at restoring the old racial hierarchy under a new name. As the century wanes, Maryland rushes headlong into the Gilded Age, its contradictions only deepening. Baltimore explodes as an industrial powerhouse. Its factories produce canning machinery, ready-made clothing, and fertilizers from the phosphates of the bone-crushing yards. The port hums with immigrant labor, Germans, Irish, Poles, and Italians, who crowd into row houses in tight-knit neighborhoods. Johns Hopkins University and Hospital, founded in 1876, bring a new era of intellectual and medical prestige. Yet in the same city, Jim Crow tightens its grip. Segregation becomes law and custom. In the countryside, the old plantation manners fade, but the economic power of the Eastern Shore's agricultural and seafood oligarchy remains, now often controlled by absentee corporations. The 1800s close with Maryland forever altered, yet forever wrestling with its dual nature. It had been a slave state that never left the Union, a battlefield that witnessed both liberation and terror, an industrial juggernaut with a rural, traditionalist heart. The railroad had tied it to the North's destiny, while the tides of the Chesapeake whispered of a more complicated, layered past. Its landscape was now inscribed with the memory of both Frederick Douglass's first moments of freedom and the horrific carnage of Antietam. The century forged no single Maryland identity, but rather an enduring tension, a constant, uneasy, and productive negotiation between its competing histories. The small state had not solved the American dilemma, but for 100 turbulent years, it had lived every agonizing moment of it. Its story was not one of resolution, but of a perpetual and defining struggle, a microcosm in the middle passage of a nation's becoming.